almost forgot to go live. So, simple Mendelian inheritance. We've seen that we can have a dominant or a recessive trait. And for the majority, that's what Mendel saw, was that you can have these dominant and recessive traits that independently assort and segregate. Right, so he had those two laws of independent assortment and segregation, but these dominant and recessive traits he said, if you were a dominant form of the trait, you mask the recessive allele, as in the case of a heterozygote. And for a recessive, you need 2 copies in order to have the recessive phenotype. In other words, the dominant allele can't be present. Okay, that's kind of the basis of how we can start to interpret some of these pedigrees. That's what we've been talking about, but it turns out that there's a lot more to this picture of inheritance than Mendel originally suggested. So that's why we were titling this Beyond Mendelian Genetics. So the first thing that he noticed, or not he noticed, but somebody else noticed, was that there are genes that actually don't follow this idea of independent assortment and segregation because they're located on sex chromosomes. And Mr. Anderson talked about this yesterday. But our first example of being beyond Mendelian genetics are sex-linked traits. The first example of being beyond Mendelian inheritance is the idea of sex-linked traits, and the quick overview is that a sex-linked trait is a trait encoded by a gene on a sex chromosome. Not an autosome. Right, remember the autosomes were chromosomes 1 through 22? It was found that some traits, they actually get inherited through sex chromosomes. And almost always, the gene is on the X chromosome. And there's a couple reasons for that. Probably the most practical reason is that the X chromosome, if this is our X chromosome, is much bigger than the Y chromosome. So in comparison, it looks kind of like this. So they actually don't look like the autosomes, which are in these pairs that are equal size. Bless you. And so just by being larger, there are many more genes on the X. Right. Very, very rarely will we talk about Y-linked traits. Almost always when we say sex-linked, you can assume X-linked inheritance. X-linked inheritance. So, some examples of this. Color blindness, and hemophilia are probably the two big examples of sex-linked traits. Okay. So when it's determined that a sex-linked trait is being passed along through generations, some patterns that we see is that the trait is more common in males than females. And the reason why that is most X-linked traits are actually recessive. And so if we think about this, let's say we talk about color blindness. So color blindness, we're going to say the recessive is color blindness, and the dominant is no color blindness. Okay. And the way that we annotate this is that we actually say that on the X chromosome, we're going to use, let's use B. The letters are irrelevant, but we annotate like this. So this means that if this person has this allele, they have the dominant allele on the X chromosome. So we don't just write it as a separate B, but we annotate it like this. So if you are a female, biological female, there are two X chromosomes that you inherited, right? In order to have color blindness, you need two recessive copies, right? But for a male that's colorblind, you only inherit one X chromosome. And so actually, if you just get that recessive allele on the X chromosome, you have color blindness. You actually don't need two copies because the Y, again, does not typically have the same genes as the X. Okay. So this would be a colorblind male here. This is a colorblind female. Okay. So, what we're going to look at how this plays out in an actual pedigree. So we're going to put this aside just for a moment. So sex-linked traits, first example of a non-Mendelian inheritance. So let's look at how does this look in a pedigree.